Good morning, everyone. It's John, and it's been a while, but I'm back. And instead of another book haul for you this morning, I have a book review. It's been a long time since I posted one, but I thought I would sort of get back to the roots of what this channel was supposed to be all about before I started buying way too many books. But I recently, and by recently I mean 4 or 6 weeks ago, finished this book, Myself as Witness, by James Goldman, and the subtitle, in case you can't read it, is a novel by the author of A Lion in Winter. You may not have read A Lion in Winter, but hopefully you've at least heard of the movie, and hopefully you've seen the movie if you've heard of it. It is an absolutely fabulous film. I'm talking about the 1968 version with Katharine Hepburn and Peter O'Toole, not the horrible travesty of a remake that they did in 2003. But this author, James Goldman, he wrote a play called A Lion in Winter in the early 60s, which they wasted not much time, maybe just a few years, in turning into sort of this wonderful cinematic production. And I think, for the most part, that's the only thing people remember James Goldman for, is writing that play. Sometimes you can still find copies of it in new bookstores. It's very much still in print, I think. But he was also a novelist. Wrote several plays, I think, but also several novels, and this was one of them. He wrote it about a dozen years or so after he wrote the play that the movie was based off of. So you might understand my excitement when I heard about this book from the enthusiastic review of another booktuber. The movie, by the way, is, in case you're not familiar, which you definitely should become familiar with if you're not, it's about the political intrigues and the personal lives of the family of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. So, of course, Henry II himself is King of England, and with Henry, Eleanor has, more than two children, but two sons who become king. King John, famous for the Magna Carta, and Richard I, the Lion-Hearted. This book, Myself as Witness, is all about King John and some of the sort of adventures and goings-on in his personal and diplomatic life. It wasn't until, like I said, several years later, after he wrote the play, in 1979, that James Goldman got around to writing this novel, not about Henry II, but his perhaps second most well-known son, King John. Goldman adds a preface to this book suggesting that there have been a few details discovered about John that have changed the light in which we might perceive him historically, but he's not nearly as ruthless and ham-handed as, or that he might not have been nearly as ruthless and ham-handed and cruel as historians have written him to be. For what it's worth, though, James Goldman's own portrayal of him in the novel is far from what I would call sympathetic. He doesn't come off looking great, but he's also not an evil villain either. But to put it simply, he's just a human being. Myself as Witness begins in the year 1212, 3 years before the signing of the Magna Carta, with King John abruptly requesting the services of his favorite court historian to accompany him to record his own sort of res gustae. His choice for a court historian is none other than Giraldus Cambrensis, perhaps better known by his anglicized name Gerald of Wales. In 1212, the real historical Gerald, and he was a real historical person, would have been around 65 years old, more than old enough to have continued living the rest of his life in secluded retirement as the former bishop in England, Bishop of Lincoln, excuse me, not Bishop of England, Bishop of Lincoln, working on his scholarly work, writing, reading, etc. But feeling compelled to serve King John, he lays aside his studies and decides to join John and his confreres on his travels. The real historical Richard traveled with King John, but much earlier, uh, in an expedition to Ireland in 1185. There is actually no historical evidence that John actually called Gerald out of retirement at any time in his 60s to travel with him. Even though Gerald was, as I said, still alive at that time. Not a lot of people lived into their 60s in the early 13th century. The events that Gerald records in the next few years weren't ones that John was anticipating on happening. He is defeated at the hands of the French army. He is forced to give up to the demands of the Pope, and he has to deal with a group of his own insurgent barons who are constantly petitioning him for greater and greater liberties. Of course, all of these events culminate in what else? Barons petitioning the king in the early 13th century for more rights. Certainly sounds like something everyone should be kind of familiar with, the Magna Carta. So everything is kind of building up to this, to John's being forced to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede. The entire book is epistolary in form. It doesn't take the form of letters, but instead of diary entries in Gerald's own personal diary, stitched together from entries that he makes during the journey that he's on with John. And while this form of writing sort of has the virtue of letting you get a better feel for Gerald's own psychological drives and desires, it somewhat robs you of getting the same thing from other characters. You get to know Gerald really well, the inner intentions and drives and motivations of other people, not so much. So the book's plot is fast-paced, leaves only a little bit of room for reflection. But there is some, and it's interesting when it happens. It tends to be on the nature of history, writing history, what history is, things like that. I wish there was a lot more of that, though. For those of us who are interested in a more meditative reading experience, maybe not so much of a narrative gallop, but something more meandering, Gerald's diary entries can read as a bit too quick, too brusque, and staccato to come off as really talented writing. I think my problem with it was that Goldman writes like a playwright. He writes dialogue very well, but when he's not writing dialogue, it tends to not be as convincing or well written. That was my personal impression. It also leaves little time for characters to think back on events, so less time for reflection and sort of reminiscence about what's been learned about history or just events that they've taken part in. I would have loved to have seen a book either after this or in place of this about everything that took place in the book in a chapter or two, and then Gerald going back to his old station as retired Bishop of Lincoln and remembering and thinking and writing about the book instead of it taking place in real time. We see Gerald as a delightful combination of cynical, wise, detached, and showing a sort of deep and respectful solicitude for his very, very flawed King John. As someone who is much more used to slow-paced, I guess you could call it more self-consciously literary fiction, I enjoyed this for what it was, but the short choppy diary entries that tend to be anywhere from maybe half a page to 3 or 4 pages. And sort of the uneven character development really left me wanting more. Maybe the Angevins are just better suited to the stage and the cinema than they are the novel. Anyway, if you have read the play Lion in Winter, or if you've seen the movie, or if you've read a novel by James Goldman especially, please leave me a comment and let me know if there are any that are maybe better than this. I would be interested to know. Myself as Witness, a novel by the author of A Lion in Winter. You gotta get that in there when that's your bread and butter, by James Goldman. I will see everyone, probably not next week to be honest, but soon enough. Bye.